My name is Lillian, and I'm 58 years old. For most of my life, I've prided myself on being the glue that holds my family together. I spent over 30 years as a school principal, and even though I'm retired now, that same sense of order and tradition follows me into everything I do, especially Christmas. Christmas has always been my holiday. It's the one time of year when everyone comes home, no matter how busy or far away they are. Every ornament, every piece of decor in my home carries a story. I've been hosting Christmas since I was in my 20s, and not once have we celebrated anywhere else. It's our ritual, our anchor. After my husband, Henry, passed away 10 years ago, I made sure to keep it alive for our children, Daniel and Emma. It wasn't easy at first. His absence left a hollow in every carol, every toast. But slowly, the laughter returned, and our gatherings became moments of healing instead of pain. This year, though, things felt different from the start. Daniel had called me 2 weeks before Christmas with what he described as a small update. He told me that his wife, Olivia, wanted to invite her parents to join us for the holiday. I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't that I disliked Olivia's family, I barely knew them. But Christmas at my house had always been intimate, just us. Still, I told him it was fine. Family should grow, not shrink. When I hung up the phone, though, I couldn't shake a certain unease. Olivia was always polite but polished. Almost too much so. The kind of woman who never let her hair down, not even on holidays. Her parents, Gordon and Maeve, were the same way: old money, sharp suits, and a quiet arrogance that filled every room before they even spoke. I wanted to make them feel welcome, but I also knew they'd bring a certain stiffness to our usually warm, chaotic celebrations. On Christmas Eve, I stayed up late, wrapping gifts and preparing my famous cranberry glaze. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted pine. I set the table exactly as Henry used to love it: gold napkins, red candles, and the centerpiece we bought together our first year of marriage. Everything felt perfect. The next morning, I woke up early, as always, to start the coffee and light the fireplace. That's when I noticed something strange. The living room looked rearranged. My armchair, the one I always sat in for opening gifts, wasn't where it was supposed to be. For as long as I can remember, that chair has been my spot. It's more than just furniture. It's where Henry and I sat together on our first Christmas as husband and wife, where I cradled Daniel when he had the flu, where I read bedtime stories to Emma every December night. When Henry died, that chair became my sanctuary. It still smelled faintly of his cologne, and sitting there brought me peace. I frowned, scanning the room. In its place stood a large, dark leather recliner that definitely hadn't been there before. It was newer, bigger, and utterly out of place amid my traditional decor. I ran my hand along it, cold, sleek, impersonal. Just then, Daniel walked in, holding a mug of coffee. "Morning, Mom," he said casually, handing it to me. I smiled, but my eyes stayed fixed on the chair. "Daniel," I asked slowly, "where's my chair?" He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Oh, about that. Olivia and I made a small change. Her dad's coming, remember? We thought it'd be nice for him to have a comfortable seat." I blinked. "You mean my chair?" He nodded, as if it were nothing. "Yeah, it's in the den. We just figured this one would be better for him, he's got back problems." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The words stuck in my throat like dry bread. "You replaced my chair. For your father-in-law?" Daniel looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. "It's just for Christmas, Mom. Don't make it a big deal." Before I could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway, dressed perfectly in a cream sweater and pearl earrings, her smile as polished as ever. "Good morning, Lillian. I hope you don't mind the little swap. Dad's been struggling with his spine, and this chair is more supportive." I forced a polite smile. "Of course," I said, though my voice trembled. "I wouldn't want him to be uncomfortable." Gordon arrived shortly after, tall and broad-shouldered, exuding confidence. When he saw the leather chair, his face lit up. "Now that's a proper seat," he said, lowering himself into it with a satisfied grunt. He stretched, looked around, and added, "Feels like home already." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his home, that it was mine. But I didn't. Not on Christmas morning. Instead, I stood quietly by the window, holding my coffee, watching the snow fall outside. The sound of laughter filled the room, but to me, it all felt distant, hollow. It wasn't just a chair that had been replaced that morning. Something deeper had shifted something in the balance of my home, my authority, my place in this family. And as Gordon leaned back, commanding the room with his loud opinions and booming laugh, I felt an unease rise in me that I couldn't quite name yet. When I walked into my living room, my chair was gone. "We thought Gordon should sit there, Mom. He's the guest of honor," Daniel told me, trying to sound casual. His words echoed in my head, sharp and dismissive. Guest of honor? Since when did we have guests of honor at our family Christmas? I'd always believed that Christmas wasn't about hierarchy, it was about family, love, and memories shared over steaming cups of cocoa. But apparently, this year came with new rules. I stood there, staring at the spot where my old armchair used to rest, the heart of the living room, right by the fire. Now, that space was dominated by Gordon's bulky recliner, like a throne dropped into the middle of my home. The sight made my chest tighten. Olivia floated over, as though reading from a script she'd practiced in the mirror. "It's just more fitting, Lillian," she said sweetly. "Dad's used to a certain level of comfort. You know how hard he's worked all his life, he deserves it." Her tone was perfectly polite, yet every word landed like a slap. I managed a tight smile and murmured, "Of course." But inside, I was screaming. I turned away and busied myself with the turkey, though my hands trembled slightly as I basted it. Behind me, I could hear Gordon settling into my chair. The sound of leather creaking and his satisfied sigh burned in my ears. He immediately began commanding attention. "Ah, this is perfect," he boomed. "Now this is how a man should sit, central, comfortable, and in control." The room went quiet for a moment before Daniel laughed nervously. "Yeah, Dad. Mr. Reeves, glad you like it." I caught Emma's eye across the table. She frowned slightly, sensing my discomfort. Emma had always been perceptive, always the quiet observer. She didn't need me to explain how I felt. She could see it written across my face. I tried to stay composed, reminding myself that peace during the holidays was worth swallowing a bit of pride. But every time Gordon spoke, his voice filled the air like smoke. He talked about his business ventures, his golf club, and the proper way to host a family gathering. At one point, he even adjusted the thermostat without asking, muttering, "Too warm in here. People get lazy when it's too cozy." Olivia nodded approvingly. Daniel stayed silent. When dinner was finally ready, I placed the dishes on the table. The food smelled wonderful, but the joy of the meal felt dulled, as though the spirit of the holiday had been stripped away and replaced with something colder. We all sat down, and Gordon didn't wait for anyone to speak first. "Now, before we dig in," he said, raising his glass, "I'd like to thank Daniel and Olivia for bringing real sophistication into this home." I froze. The implication hung in the air like a bad odor. Real sophistication? I thought bitterly. My home had been filled with warmth, laughter, and tradition long before Olivia's family entered the picture. Still, I lifted my glass out of politeness, though I didn't drink. Gordon leaned back in the chair, stretching his arms. "You know, Lillian," he began, "you've got a fine home here, but it's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? A woman like you should embrace modern comfort." I bit the inside of my cheek, refusing to let him see how deeply that stung. "I rather like old-fashioned," I replied softly. "It reminds me of what really matters," he chuckled. "Yes, sentimentality is a woman's specialty." The words hit me harder than I expected. Daniel laughed weakly, as though trying to diffuse the tension, but Emma shot him a glare that made him stop immediately. Throughout the evening, Gordon dominated every conversation. He corrected people's grammar, told long-winded stories about his business triumphs, and made subtle digs at my simpler way of life. Olivia seemed to hang on every word he said. "Daddy's just so wise," she cooed at one point. "He's taught me everything about discipline and leadership." I could barely stand it. My heart ached not just from the disrespect, but from watching my son nod and smile, pretending this all made sense. The Daniel I raised had always been kind, grounded, and empathetic. But here he was, acting like a little boy desperate for approval from a man who treated him like an apprentice. I stayed quiet, though. That's what I do when I'm angry, I go still. I let silence do my speaking for me. After dinner, I started clearing the table. But Gordon waved his hand. No, no. Let the younger ones handle that, he said. You've done enough. Sit and rest. He pointed to a dining chair nearby, not my chair, of course. That seat was still occupied by him. He looked perfectly comfortable, his fingers drumming against the armrest, his eyes half closed in smug satisfaction. I sat down where he told me to, my back straight and my jaw tight. Across the room, the firelight flickered against the polished wood of the recliner. It glowed like a symbol of everything that had just shifted a new order, one that placed Gordon squarely at the top. But I wasn't angry just because of the chair. It wasn't even about pride. It was about what that act represented. A quiet erasure of me, of what I'd built, of what Henry and I had stood for. That chair had been my anchor, my reminder of love, legacy, and strength. By replacing it so casually, Daniel and Olivia hadn't just rearranged furniture, they'd rearranged loyalty. As I sat there, smiling politely at their laughter, I realized something chilling. Gordon wasn't simply a guest in my house, he'd come to dominate it. And Daniel, willingly or not, had given him the key. I realized then that this wasn't just about a chair, it was about control. The man didn't just take my chair. He took command of my house. By the time the first round of presents was opened, Gordon had already made himself the center of everything. It was subtle at first, a comment here, a suggestion there, but before long, it was like he'd been the head of this family all along. He sat there in my chair, legs spread wide, coffee in one hand, pointing toward the tree as if he were orchestrating the entire holiday. Daniel, grab that one for Olivia. No, not that one, the big one with the silver bow. A man should always make sure his wife gets the best first. Daniel chuckled obediently, though the sound was uneasy, hollow. I stood by the fireplace, pretending to tidy up the wrapping paper, watching this performance unfold. The smell of pine and cinnamon was still in the air. But it no longer felt like Christmas, it felt like a show Gordon was directing. Olivia hovered near him, her face bright with admiration. Isn't he amazing? She said to Emma, as though expecting agreement. He just brings everyone together so naturally. Emma looked up from her spot near the tree, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. He's definitely something, she replied quietly. Gordon grinned, seemingly oblivious to her tone. Leadership runs in the family, he said, puffing out his chest. I've built teams, run companies, negotiated deals. I always say if you want things done right, you have to take charge. He looked right at me as he said it. I smiled politely, though my jaw tightened. Well, I said softly. Some of us believe in leading with kindness. He smirked, as though that idea amused him. That's sweet, Lillian, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But the world doesn't run on kindness. It runs on strength. Daniel shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Dad, Gordon, maybe we can just open the rest of the gifts? But Gordon wasn't finished. He motioned for Daniel to hand him a package, one that had been under the tree since last week. I recognized the wrapping, it was the one I'd prepared for him, out of courtesy. Inside was a high-quality wool scarf I'd chosen carefully after Daniel mentioned Gordon liked traditional accessories. He tore the paper off carelessly, holding it up. A scarf, he said flatly, as though I'd given him a fruitcake. Nice. Very classic. Olivia leaned in to inspect it. Oh, Dad, it's lovely, she said quickly, trying to smooth the tension. But the damage was done. I could feel the sting behind my eyes, though I refused to let it show. I simply nodded and said, I'm glad you like it. The morning dragged on. And the more time passed, the more Gordon filled every space with his booming voice, his unsolicited advice, and his subtle jabs at everything I valued. When I offered more coffee, he waved me off. Let Daniel handle it, he said. You've done enough. When I suggested turning on some Christmas music, he replied, maybe something more contemporary. These old carols feel a bit dated. Even my decorations, the ones Henry and I had collected for decades, weren't spared. He pointed at the hand-painted angel ornament and said, "That looks homemade. Olivia, we'll need to get them a proper set next year." Every comment, every gesture, chipped away at the warmth of my home. I glanced around the room, taking it all in, the same walls that had heard my children's laughter for years, the same tree that had seen so many beautiful mornings. But now, under Gordon's presence, it all felt foreign. Like I was a guest in my own story. At one point, Emma came over and whispered, "Mom, this is ridiculous." I shook my head. "Not today," I murmured. "Let him have his moment." Her eyes flashed with quiet anger. "You shouldn't have to put up with this." Maybe she was right. But something told me that losing my temper wouldn't just ruin Christmas, it would give Gordon exactly what he wanted. Men like him thrive on control. They feed off of reactions. And I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. So I smiled, nodded, and played the gracious hostess while every part of me simmered beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, as we all gathered around for dessert, Gordon started holding court again. "You know, Daniel," he said between bites of pie, "I've been thinking. You've got potential, but you're too soft. You let people walk over you. That's not how a man builds a future." Daniel laughed nervously. "Yeah, I guess I could be more assertive." Olivia beamed at her father. "That's what I've been telling him. Dad's always said, strength is everything." I watched my son's face, the flicker of uncertainty there, the way he tried to hide it. He wanted to please everyone, and in doing so, he was losing himself. That realization hit me harder than any insult Gordon could throw. Because this wasn't just about me, it was about Daniel being drawn into his father-in-law's shadow, learning all the wrong lessons about manhood, family, and respect. When Gordon leaned back once more in my chair, legs crossed, drink in hand, I suddenly saw it clearly. He wasn't just sitting in that seat for comfort. He was claiming ownership of the room, the day, and the people in it. He thought that by sitting there, he had power. He thought he could rewrite the order of this family, make himself the leader, and turn my son into a follower. He was wrong. I looked at that man, surrounded by my family. And in that quiet moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let this continue. I wouldn't let him rewrite our story. He might have taken my seat for now, but he'd soon learn that real power doesn't come from taking, it comes from earning. I decided that if Gordon wanted to play king, he'd soon see what real power looked like. That chair wasn't just wood and fabric, it carried the weight of my family's story. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked quietly into the living room. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Gordon's new recliner sat there like an intruder, large, glossy, impersonal. I stood in front of it for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the dark leather. It was ridiculous, I thought, how something as simple as a piece of furniture could hurt so much. But it wasn't the chair itself. It was what it stood for and what had been taken from me. I closed my eyes, remembering the day Henry first brought the old armchair home. He'd made it himself, back when we were both young and struggling, scraping together money for our first house. He'd worked on it for weeks in the garage, sanding and staining the wood until his hands blistered. He'd grin every time I peeked in, covered in sawdust, saying, "This will be your throne, Lillian. Every queen needs one." Back then, I'd laughed and told him he was ridiculous. But after we had children, that chair became part of our lives in ways I never could have predicted. It was where I nursed Daniel through his first fever, where Emma climbed into my lap to hear bedtime stories, where Henry would sit and read the newspaper every Sunday morning, pretending to be stern when the kids interrupted him. And every Christmas, that chair became our spot, the place where Henry would pass out gifts while wearing his silly Santa hat, the place where we'd take our family photos every year without fail. The worn armrests, the faded cushion, even the faint creak when you leaned back, they were all sounds of home. After Henry died, I couldn't bring myself to move the chair. For months, it just sat there, empty, like a shrine to everything I'd lost. Some nights, I'd sit in it after everyone went to bed, close my eyes, and pretend I could still feel his warmth in the cushions. That chair became my refuge, my connection to him, the last tangible piece of the life we'd built together. And now it had been shoved aside like it was nothing more than outdated decor. Earlier that evening, when Gordon had called it an old relic, I'd nearly snapped. He'd laughed as he said it, with that smug smile that dared me to disagree. And Olivia, sweet, smiling Olivia, had joined in. "We need to modernize things around here," she'd said, like she was doing me a favor. Modernize, what a fancy word for erase. I brushed my fingers over the old fabric that peeked out from under the blanket where I'd hidden the chair in the den. It still smelled faintly like cedar and cinnamon, Henry's favorite scent during the holidays. I sat down in it, sinking into the familiar comfort, and for the first time that day, I felt like myself again. "Henry," I whispered softly, "you'd be furious if you saw this." I imagined him shaking his head, half amused, half angry. He was never a man of many words, but he believed deeply in respect for family, for effort, for legacy. The thought of someone replacing his work so carelessly would have broken his heart. I stayed there for a long time, tracing the small carvings he'd etched into the arms, the initials of our family, L, H, D, and E. A little heart in the middle connected them all. It wasn't just a chair, it was us. I thought about how easily Daniel had allowed it to be replaced. I knew he hadn't meant harm. My son had always been kind but far too eager to please others, especially Olivia. She had a way of getting what she wanted without ever appearing demanding. I'd seen it before, the subtle nudges, the suggestions, the way Daniel bent to her will while believing it was his own choice. And now, with her father here, she had an ally. Still, as I sat there, I realized anger alone wouldn't fix anything. I couldn't just tell them how wrong they were, they wouldn't understand. People like Gordon didn't learn through confrontation, they learned through experience. And if this chair represented my family's history, then reclaiming it had to represent something bigger, the restoration of respect. I knew I couldn't do it impulsively. This had to be deliberate, meaningful. Something that would make them see not just the chair, but what it stood for. I thought back to when Henry was building it. I'd teased him once, asking why he was carving the base so carefully when no one would even see it. He'd smiled and said, "Because strength comes from what's underneath, not what's visible." That line came back to me now like a whisper in my ear. I took a deep breath and smiled faintly to myself. If Gordon wanted to play the part of a king, let him. Because while he strutted around in his borrowed throne, I'd be preparing the true seat of power, the one built with love, memory, and strength that no arrogance could replace. I covered the chair back up and rose slowly, my plan beginning to take shape in the back of my mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I walked back toward the living room, where the new recliner gleamed beneath the soft glow of the Christmas tree. Gordon's voice still echoed faintly from down the hall as he bragged to Daniel about leadership qualities and real authority. I glanced at the chair one last time before turning off the lights. "You think you've taken my place," I murmured under my breath. "But you have no idea what that place truly means." I made a silent promise to make them all remember what that chair truly stood for. Gordon didn't just want my chair, he wanted influence over my son. The days following Christmas Eve felt off balance, like my home was holding its breath. Gordon's presence lingered in every room, his booming voice, his heavy footsteps, even the faint scent of his cologne that clung to the air. I couldn't move anywhere without feeling his intrusion. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He'd planted himself in the center of our family dynamic, and slowly, almost methodically, he was rewriting the rules. Daniel, my son, had always been soft-spoken, thoughtful, and kind. But now, every time he spoke to Gordon, I saw something changing in him. He laughed louder, stood taller, and used words I'd never heard from him before: strategy, leverage, assertiveness. Words that belonged to Gordon's world, not ours. One afternoon, I stood in the kitchen, preparing lunch while Gordon and Daniel sat in the living room, their voices carrying easily through the open doorway. "Son," Gordon said, his tone that mix of charm and condescension he'd perfected. "You've got potential. You just need to learn how to use it." "Use it how?" Daniel asked. "You've been playing small," Gordon said. Too modest. You can't lead a family like that. You need to think bigger, take control, make decisions that benefit you. There was a pause before Daniel replied. I guess I've never thought of it that way. That's because you were raised to please people, Gordon said with a smug chuckle. Nothing wrong with that when you're a kid, but a man provides, commands, decides. Look at me, I've built everything I have because I don't ask permission. The words sliced through me. I felt my stomach twist, my hand tightening around the knife I was using to slice vegetables. Don't ask permission. That was Gordon in a nutshell. A man who mistook arrogance for strength. And now, he was pouring that poison into my son's ear. Later that evening, during dinner, I noticed how Daniel's tone had changed. He interrupted Emma when she spoke, something he'd never done before. When I offered him another helping of potatoes, he waved me off and said, Mom, I'll serve myself, thanks. The words were simple enough, but the tone, that quiet edge of superiority, was new. It sounded borrowed. Olivia watched proudly, as though she'd been waiting for this transformation. See? She said, smiling at her father. He's learning. Learning. My heart sank at that word. What exactly was he learning that dominance equals respect? That being loud means being right? Gordon leaned back in my chair again, his presence looming large. You're on the right track, son, he said. Keep that confidence. That's what separates the men from the boys. I forced a polite laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. Confidence is good, I said, but kindness builds stronger homes. He smiled, that same smug smile that never reached his eyes. Kindness is fine for women, Lillian. Men need vision. I looked him dead in the eye. Henry had both, I said quietly. For a moment, silence hung heavy over the table. Gordon shifted slightly, his smirk faltering just enough for me to notice. But Olivia jumped in quickly, laughing lightly. Oh, Dad's just teasing, she said. I thought bitterly. After dinner, Gordon began talking about investments. You've got to get your money working for you, Daniel, he said. You can't rely on salaries, that's for followers. Leaders make their own wealth. Olivia leaned forward, clearly loving every word. Dad taught me everything about financial independence, she said proudly. It's why we're saving for a new property. I could see the gleam in Daniel's eyes, the same one I'd seen in my students, when someone dangled approval just out of reach. He wasn't just listening, he was craving it. I sat silently, pretending to read a magazine while I listened to them discuss numbers, returns, and opportunities. Every sentence Gordon spoke carried the same undertone. Be like me. But what he really meant was, stop being like your mother. That realization made my heart ache. I'd spent my entire life teaching Daniel that strength and compassion could coexist, that integrity mattered more than ambition. But here was Gordon, undoing it all in the span of a few conversations. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood by the window and watched the snow fall. The lights from the tree flickered softly in the reflection, and in that moment, I felt both sadness and clarity. Gordon wasn't just trying to replace my chair, he was trying to replace me as a parent, as the moral center of this family. It wasn't enough for him to sit where I once sat. He wanted to reshape everything I had built, my traditions, my values, even my son's identity, and he was doing it under the guise of mentorship, but I wasn't blind. I saw his game for what it was. When Henry and I were raising our kids, we taught them that leadership didn't come from controlling others, it came from caring for them. Real power, Henry used to say, was quiet. It didn't demand attention, it earned it. I smiled faintly at that memory. Gordon could never understand that kind of power because he didn't believe in love as a form of strength. He believed only in winning. But what he didn't realize was that I'd already learned how to fight battles without raising my voice. Years as a principal had taught me how to handle bullies, especially the kind who masked insecurity with arrogance. So I let him talk. I let him believe he was winning. Because while Gordon reveled in his newfound control, I was paying attention, taking note of every manipulation, every condescending remark, every shift in Daniel's tone. And slowly, an idea began to form, not out of spite, but out of resolve. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't shout. I would show him, in my own way, what real strength looked like. Because some lessons can't be taught with words, they have to be demonstrated. And soon, Gordon Reeves would learn that there's a difference between sitting in a seat of power and owning it. But if they thought they could replace me, they hadn't seen the last of my resolve. Christmas dinner turned into a battlefield disguised as festivity. The table looked beautiful that evening, polished silverware, crystal glasses, candles flickering between plates of steaming food. It should have been a picture-perfect moment, the kind that made me proud every year. But this time, the warmth felt artificial. Every smile seemed rehearsed, every laugh delayed, as though we were all waiting for something to break. Gordon sat at the head of the table, my usual spot. He'd claimed it so naturally that no one dared to question it. Even Daniel hadn't said a word. I sat one seat down, on the right, watching as Gordon raised his glass for a toast. "To family," he began loudly, his voice filling the room. "And to Daniel and Olivia, for stepping up and bringing true leadership to this home." The words hit me like a slap. True leadership. The phrase echoed in my head, twisting like a knife. I kept my smile tight, but I could feel the color drain from my face. Emma's fork clinked against her plate. She glanced at me, then at Daniel. "That's quite a toast," she said, her tone even but her eyes sharp. Gordon grinned. "Just stating facts, dear. This family has good bones, but every house needs a strong foundation, strong hands guiding it. Daniel's ready for that." Olivia reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it proudly. "He really is, Dad. You've inspired him so much." I looked at my son, searching his face for any hint of resistance. For a moment, his eyes flickered toward me, uncertain, guilty almost. But then he smiled weakly and nodded. "Thanks, Gordon." The rest of dinner felt like I was trapped in someone else's house. Gordon dominated the conversation again, giving unsolicited advice about building a legacy, taking initiative, and never letting emotions rule decisions. Every time he said the word emotions, his gaze darted toward me, as if I were the living embodiment of weakness. Emma tried to steer the conversation back to happier topics. "Remember when Dad used to carve the turkey with that huge grin?" she asked softly. "He always ended up making a mess." I smiled faintly, remembering. But before I could respond, Gordon chuckled. "Sounds like a man who didn't plan ahead." The air went still. Even Olivia looked uneasy for a second. I set down my fork slowly, feeling my hands tremble, not with fear, but with a restrained fury. "He planned just fine," I said quietly. "He built this home from nothing. Everything you see around this table, the warmth, the laughter, the family exists because of him." For the first time that evening, Gordon didn't have an immediate response. He blinked, then smirked. "That's admirable," he said finally. "But times change. Sentiment can't run a family forever." I looked directly into his eyes. "No," I said. "But love can." The tension in the air grew heavy. Daniel cleared his throat and tried to change the subject. "So, Gordon, how's business been this quarter?" I wanted to scream. Even now, my son was handing him the reins, shifting the focus back to the man who'd taken so much already. I folded my hands in my lap, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Losing my temper would solve nothing. Gordon launched into another monologue about expansion, market value, and visionary decisions. Emma rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "He's acting like this is a board meeting." When dessert came out, my homemade pecan pie, Gordon barely touched it. "Too sweet," he said with a dismissive wave. "You'll never get anywhere spoiling people's tastes." That was it. Something in me hardened. I looked at him, my voice calm but firm. "You know, Gordon, for a man who talks about leadership so much, you seem awfully concerned with tearing others down." He raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" I said, I repeated evenly. "Leadership isn't about taking someone's place at the table. It's about earning your place in people's hearts." A low silence followed. Olivia's face flushed red, and Daniel looked between us like a child watching two parents argue. Emma pressed her lips together, fighting back a smirk. Gordon leaned forward, elbows on the table. You're quite the philosopher, Lillian, he said coolly. But in the real world, kindness gets eaten. Alive. I tilted my head. Maybe. But this isn't your world, Gordon. It's my home. That was the first time his smile actually faltered. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He straightened his back, brushing off my words with a scoff. You're overreacting. It's just a chair, for heaven's sake. I looked at him steadily. It stopped being about a chair the moment you decided respect was optional. No one spoke after that. The room went still except for the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we should take a break, he said. Good idea, I replied, standing. I pushed my chair back gently and turned toward the window. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the world outside in quiet white. I pressed my palms together, trying to calm my racing heart. Emma followed me into the kitchen a few minutes later. Mom, she whispered, you don't have to sit through this. I shook my head. No, sweetheart. I need to. Because this wasn't just about Gordon anymore, it was about Daniel. About reminding him who he was before arrogance and approval started shaping him into someone else. As the laughter resumed faintly in the other room, I stepped out onto the porch. The cold air stung my face, clearing my thoughts. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything Gordon had taken: my seat, my peace, and my son's confidence in his own goodness. But as I stood there, I realized something else. He'd underestimated me. He thought I was fragile because I stayed quiet. He mistook silence for weakness. But I'd spent my entire life teaching children how to stand up to bullies, and now, it was time to teach a grown man the same lesson. I looked back through the window at Gordon lounging in my chair, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside. I was going to reclaim my chair and everything it represented. While they laughed inside, I was crafting my quiet revenge. That night, the house hummed with the low murmur of conversation and clinking glasses, but I stayed out on the porch, my thoughts sharper than the winter air. Snow blanketed the yard, glittering under the porch light, and each breath left a cloud that faded as quickly as my patience. Inside, Gordon's laughter boomed again, confident, self-satisfied, oblivious. I clenched my hands around the railing and smiled to myself. Let him have his victory for tonight. Because tomorrow, I would take back what was mine. When everyone finally went to bed, I moved quietly through the house, my slippers barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. I passed the living room, where Gordon's recliner sat in the center of everything like a monument to arrogance. For a moment I stood there, studying it, then turned toward the hallway that led to the den. I opened the door slowly, the faint smell of cedar and age greeting me like an old friend. There, in the corner, covered by a sheet, was Henry's chair. My chair. The true heart of this home. I approached it, running my fingers along the outline through the cloth. It felt solid. Grounded just like him. I lifted the cover, and dust swirled in the lamplight. The wood was a little worn, but the craftsmanship still shone through. I could almost hear Henry's voice again, teasing me as he sanded the armrests, his favorite record playing in the background. This will outlast both of us, he'd said. As long as this chair stands, this home will too. He'd been right. I dragged out the small wooden chest I kept in the corner of the room, one that held all the little pieces of Henry's handiwork, old tools, scraps of fabric, and something I hadn't touched in years, a small wooden plaque. When I held it up, my throat tightened. It was engraved with the words, "Seat of Power." Henry had made it as a joke years ago. He'd said, "Every queen needs her throne," and nailed it discreetly under the chair's seat where only I knew it existed. I'd forgotten about it for a while, but seeing it now felt like fate whispering through time. The plaque was simple but meaningful, a private emblem of love and strength. And suddenly, I knew exactly what to do. If Gordon wanted to sit like a king, then I'd show him what a true throne represented. It wasn't arrogance or authority, it was legacy. I spent the next few hours restoring the chair. I wiped away the dust, polished the arms, tightened the joints, and replaced the cushion with the one I'd reupholstered years ago. My hands moved with purpose, each stroke of the cloth steady and deliberate. I worked in silence, save for the faint crackle of the fire in the other room and the occasional creak of the floorboards above as the others slept. With every polish, every turn of the wrench, I felt my strength returning, the quiet confidence that Gordon had tried to erode. By the time I finished, the wood gleamed under the lamplight, and the scent of lemon oil filled the room. I sat down and leaned back, the familiar creak greeting me like an old lullaby. My body sank into the contours perfectly, as though it had been waiting all along for me to return. I looked around the room, my heart steady. This was more than a chair. This was history. Then I picked up the seat of power plaque and smiled. Tomorrow morning I'd place it where everyone could see it, no longer hidden beneath the seat, but displayed proudly. I wanted Gordon to read it. I wanted Olivia to read it. And I wanted Daniel to remember. As I stood to leave, I noticed the clock on the wall, 2:47 a.m. The house was silent, wrapped in sleep. I tiptoed to the window and peeked outside. The snow had stopped, leaving the yard pristine and untouched. It looked like the world itself had paused, waiting for morning to reveal what I'd done. Before going to bed, I made one final stop in the living room. Gordon's recliner sat there smugly, its leather surface reflecting the faint glow of the Christmas lights. It looked so foreign, so wrong in that space. I reached out and touched it, feeling its cold, lifeless surface. "Enjoy your seat while it lasts," I whispered. Then, with a quiet determination, I began planning every step of the next day. I'd wake up early before anyone else. I'd move Gordon's chair out of the room and replace it with mine, positioned exactly as it always had been. The seat of power plaque would rest right on top of it, gleaming in the morning light. No arguments, no shouting, no scenes. Just a statement, silent, powerful, undeniable. I knew Gordon wouldn't take it well. Men like him rarely did when their illusion of control slipped away. But this wasn't about starting a fight. It was about restoring balance, reminding everyone, including my son, where true respect came from. When I finally lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My heart beat steadily, not with anger anymore, but with purpose. I thought about Henry again, and for the first time in years, I felt him near. "Wish me luck, Henry," I murmured into the dark. "Tomorrow I take back our place." The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the furnace, and in that quiet, I could almost hear his reply, that deep, steady voice filled with calm assurance. "You've always had it, Lil," he would have said. "They just forgot." I smiled, my eyes finally drifting shut. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the true heart of this family would be seen again. The house would wake up to a very different kind of Christmas morning. The sun rose over a house unaware of the storm I was about to bring. The morning light crept slowly through the curtains, spilling across the living room floor. For the first time in years, I felt wide awake before dawn, charged with purpose. The quiet before everyone stirred was my sanctuary, the perfect window to set things right. I slipped on my robe and slippers, my breath visible in the chill of the early hour. Every step I took felt deliberate. I walked past the kitchen, the faint scent of pine and yesterday's roast still lingering in the air, and stopped in the living room doorway. There it was, Gordon's monstrous recliner sitting proudly in the place where my memories used to rest. Its dark leather reflected the twinkle of the Christmas lights that I'd left on overnight. They blinked cheerfully, unaware of the war this room had seen the day before. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of what I was about to do sink in. Then I rolled up my sleeves. The recliner was heavy, but I'd moved heavier things in my life. I got a good grip on its cold arms and pushed. It scraped against the hardwood, the sound loud enough to make me freeze for a moment. I paused, listening, no movement upstairs. Good. I pushed harder, inch by inch, until it cleared the rug and rested near the doorway. Then I took a deep breath, wiped my brow, and went down the hall to the den. There, bathed in soft morning light, waited Henry's chair. It gleamed now, freshly polished, glowing with a quiet dignity that no expensive leather could ever imitate. I felt my heart swell just looking at it. "This is where you belong," I whispered. I lifted it lighter than I remembered and carried it carefully into the living room. It was as though every creak of the wood sang with memory. I placed it back in its rightful spot by the fire, the way it had sat for decades. The moment it touched the rug, something inside me settled. Then, I took out the plaque seat of power and laid it gently across the cushion. Its carved letters caught the glow of the Christmas lights, shining with quiet pride. I stepped back and looked at the scene. It was perfect. It didn't shout for attention like Gordon's chair. It didn't demand authority. It simply belonged. This room, this house, this family, everything had revolved around this spot for years, and now, balance had been restored. I made coffee and waited. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and grounding. The kind of smell that makes a house feel alive. Soon, I heard footsteps upstairs, Daniel's voice, then Olivia's. The day was beginning. I poured myself a cup and sat in the chair. It creaked familiarly beneath me, and I smiled. When I leaned back, it felt as though the entire house exhaled with me. A few minutes later, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her hair perfectly in place even this early. She froze when she saw me. Her eyes darted from me to the plaque, then back again. "Lillian," she said slowly, "what's this?" "Good morning," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. I just thought it was time things went back to how they were. Before she could respond, Daniel came in, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, what?" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the scene. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. "Where's Dad's chair?" he finally asked. "In the hallway," I said simply. "Your father-in-law can still sit comfortably, just not there." Olivia frowned. "Mom, this isn't..." I cut her off gently. "It's my home, dear. And this chair belongs here. It always has." She glanced toward the plaque, her lips tightening. "Seat of power?" she read aloud, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Really?" I smiled. "Yes. My husband made it. It's a reminder that power doesn't come from where you sit, but from what you stand for." Olivia folded her arms. "This is childish." "Maybe," I said. "But so is taking something that wasn't yours to begin with." Before the tension could stretch too far, Gordon's voice rumbled from the hallway. "What's going on in here?" He appeared in the doorway, adjusting his robe. His gaze landed on me, then on the chair. His face darkened. "Why is my seat gone?" he demanded. "Because," I said, calmly, "it was never yours." He blinked, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. "Excuse me?" "This is my home, Gordon," I said, meeting his glare without flinching. "And that chair has been part of this family long before you decided to sit in it." He stepped closer. "Then it shouldn't bother you that it's back where it belongs." Daniel looked between us, clearly torn. "Mom, maybe we can..." "Son," I said softly. "You know who built this chair." He hesitated, his voice small. "Dad did." "And you know why?" I continued. "Because he wanted a place that represented our family, a seat for love, not pride." Olivia groaned quietly, but Daniel didn't look away. His eyes lingered on the plaque. And I saw the flicker of realization there, the faint memory of childhood Christmas mornings, of laughter and warmth that had nothing to do with power. Gordon crossed his arms. "This is absurd. You're making a scene over sentiment." "Maybe so," I replied evenly. "But sentiment is what built this family, not your ego." He glared, his nostrils flaring, but I didn't move. I stayed seated, calm and composed, the morning light catching the edge of the plaque beside me. For once, Gordon didn't have the last word. Daniel broke the silence. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "let's just have breakfast. It's fine." Gordon muttered something under his breath but turned away, his pride bruised. Olivia followed him, fuming quietly. I stayed seated, sipping my coffee, watching the fire crackle to life in front of me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of quiet victory. Because for the first time in days, the room felt right again. He had no idea that this was just the beginning of his humiliation. When Gordon demanded his seat back, I didn't move an inch. The air in the room had changed it. It was no longer thick with festivity or laughter. It was tense, charged, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see who would break first. Gordon stood in front of me, his face red with disbelief, his chest puffed out like a man who wasn't used to being told no. "That's my chair now," he said firmly, his voice low but trembling with anger. I tilted my head slightly. "Actually, it's mine and always has been." He took a step closer, trying to tower over me. "Don't be ridiculous, Lillian. It's just a seat. You're making this bigger than it is." I smiled faintly. "Then you shouldn't mind standing." Behind him, Olivia gasped softly. "Mom," she said, her voice sharp. "You're overreacting. This isn't worth creating drama over." "Drama?" I repeated. My tone calm but edged. "Someone replaced a piece of my life without asking, and I'm the one creating drama?" Daniel shifted awkwardly, his hands jammed into his pockets. "Mom, please, let's not do this." "Let's not do what, Daniel?" I said. My voice quiet but steady. "Let's not talk about how easily my things were pushed aside. Or how quickly you agreed to it." He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at Gordon, then back at me. As if torn between two worlds, one he knew and one he'd been taught to admire. Gordon's laugh broke the silence. "You're being sentimental, Lillian. This isn't about respect, it's about you being unable to adapt." I rose slowly from the chair, the wood creaking softly as if lending its voice to mine. "You're right, Gordon. I don't adapt well when people try to take what isn't theirs." His smile faltered. "Do you even understand what that chair means?" I continued. "My husband built it, with his own hands. It's been part of every memory this family has ever made, every Christmas, every birthday, every bedtime story." Gordon scoffed. "It's just furniture. To you, maybe," I said quietly. "To us, it's history." Olivia sighed, crossing her arms. "Mom, you're turning this into some kind of power struggle. You don't need a chair to prove your place here." I turned to her, my voice soft but certain. "I don't need it, Olivia." "But your father thought he did." Gordon's jaw tightened. "I didn't take anything from you. I was offered the chair." I looked at Daniel, who avoided my eyes. "By whom?" I asked. "By my son, in my own house, without a second thought." Daniel swallowed hard. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that. You just wanted to keep the peace." I finished for him. "You thought giving him what he wanted would make things easier. But peace built on disrespect isn't peace, Daniel, it's surrender." He blinked, his face reddening slightly. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," I said softly, "but it's true." The room fell silent again. The only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace. I could see Gordon growing more irritated by the second, his pride wounded that anyone dared to challenge him in front of his family. He straightened his back and gestured toward the chair. "Fine. You've made your point. Now move, Lillian." I looked him dead in the eye. "No." His expression shifted confusion, then disbelief. "Excuse me?" I said no, I repeated, my tone firm but composed. "This isn't about comfort or courtesy anymore. This is about respect, something you've forgotten the meaning of." He took a step forward, his voice rising. "Don't lecture me in my own daughter's presence." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. I'd rather let my actions speak." Olivia placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. "Dad, it's not worth it." But he brushed her off. "No, this is absurd. I'm not going to stand here while she plays queen over a chair." That word queen made me laugh softly. "Funny," I said. "My husband used to say the same thing, except when he said it, it was out of love." Daniel's eyes flicked up at me. "Dad used to call you that," he said quietly, almost to himself. I nodded. He did. Because he understood that strength isn't about dominating a room, it's about nurturing it. Keeping it whole. That's what this chair represents. Something flickered in Daniel's expression, recognition, maybe even guilt. I could see him remembering the man his father was. Steady, kind, the opposite of Gordon. Gordon laughed dryly. So now it's sacred? It always was, I replied. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward hesitantly. Mom, he said, I didn't realize how much this meant to you. I just thought it was a seat. I smiled at him gently. And now you know it's more than that. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet. Yeah, I do. Gordon exhaled sharply, frustration rolling off him in waves. Daniel, are you really letting her turn this into a circus? Daniel looked at him, then at me, and for the first time, I saw something shift behind his eyes. His shoulders squared slightly, and his voice, though soft, carried a firmness I hadn't heard in years. No, Gordon, he said. I'm not letting her turn it into anything. I think she's right. Olivia blinked. Daniel. He held up a hand, silencing her. We didn't mean any harm. But we were wrong. This house. This chair, it's Mom's history. We had no right to take that away from her. Gordon's face darkened. You're being manipulated. Daniel shook his head. No, I'm remembering. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling truth. Gordon looked at him as if he couldn't believe he'd been challenged. For a man so used to control, it was almost painful to watch his authority crumble in real time. I sat back down in my chair, calm and composed. The plaque beside me gleamed faintly in the firelight. You wanted a seat of power, Gordon, I said softly. Well, here it is. And now you can see where it truly belongs. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Olivia followed reluctantly, her expression somewhere between anger and embarrassment. For a moment, the room was silent again. Then Daniel exhaled slowly and sat down across from me. Mom, he said, his voice thick. I'm sorry. I reached out and took his hand. Don't be. You just needed to remember where you come from. The fire popped softly between us, and for the first time in days, I felt something shift not just in the room but in my son. The spell was breaking. Gordon's arrogance began to crumble as the truth filled the room. Daniel finally spoke up, breaking the silence that had weighed heavy for days. He sat across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression caught somewhere between shame and relief. The tension in the house seemed to soften for the first time in what felt like forever. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, its glow dancing across the walls. Mom, he began quietly. I didn't realize how much that chair meant to you. I swear, I didn't. I smiled gently. It's not just the chair, sweetheart. It's everything it represents. It's family, history. Your father. His eyes dropped, and he nodded slowly. I remember sitting in Dad's lap when I was a kid, right here. He used to read those corny holiday stories and do all the voices. I chuckled softly. He loved doing that. Daniel smiled faintly. Yeah. He'd get so into it. And he'd tickle me halfway through the story until I couldn't breathe from laughing. His voice cracked a little at the end. And I could see the little boy in him again, the one who used to run around the tree in his pajamas, not the man who'd been trying to impress another man's ego. He looked up at me again, his eyes glossy. I think I got so caught up trying to be successful that I forgot what success actually looks like. I've been chasing approval from everyone, from work, from Olivia, from Gordon, and I guess I thought that's what being a man meant. I reached over and touched his hand. Being a man isn't about who you impress, Daniel. It's about who you protect, who you stand up for. Your father didn't build this chair because he wanted power. He built it because he wanted to give us comfort, stability. Daniel's jaw tightened as he nodded. He always had that quiet kind of strength. I used to think it was just because he didn't like to argue, but now I get it. He didn't need to. I smiled softly. Exactly. For a while we just sat there in silence, letting the warmth of the fire fill the space between us. It was the kind of silence that felt safe again, no tension, no performance. Just truth. After a moment, Daniel exhaled deeply and leaned back. You know, Gordon keeps talking about power like it's something you can hold on to. But sitting here now, I think I finally get it. Power isn't something you take, it's something you're trusted with. I felt a lump rise in my throat. My son was waking up, really waking up. Before I could respond, I heard footsteps behind us. Gordon had returned. His face was still tight, but his voice was quieter now, laced with false calm. "Are we done with this little display?" he asked. "Can we get back to having a normal Christmas?" Daniel turned to face him, his voice steady. "Actually, Gordon, we're having one right now." Gordon frowned. "Excuse me?" "This," Daniel said, gesturing to the fire, to me, to the chair. "This is what Christmas is supposed to be. Family, not competition," Gordon scoffed. "Competition? You're overreacting." Daniel stood slowly. "No, I'm not. You've been treating this house like a stage for your ego since the minute you walked in. You talk about leadership and strength, but all you've shown is disrespect." Olivia appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. "Daniel, stop. You're being rude to my father." He looked at her, his eyes sad but firm. "No, Liv, I'm being honest. There's a difference." She blinked, clearly not expecting him to push back. "He's just trying to help you." Daniel shook his head. "No, he's trying to shape me into someone I'm not." Gordon's nostrils flared. "So what, you'd rather be weak?" "No," Daniel said calmly. "I'd rather be kind. I'd rather be the kind of man my father was, the kind who built something real. Not the kind who takes things just to prove he can." The room fell silent. Even Olivia didn't have a quick response for that. I sat quietly, my heart swelling with pride. I could see Henry in him, in his posture, in his voice, in the calm conviction that came from finally seeing clearly. Gordon looked away, his jaw tightening. "Well," he muttered, "if you're all done moralizing, I'll just pack my things. Clearly my presence isn't appreciated." Olivia gasped. "Dad, don't..." But Daniel interrupted softly. "Maybe that's for the best." Her head snapped toward him. "What?" He sighed. "I love you, Liv, but we need boundaries. You and your father don't get to come into this house and decide what respect looks like. That's not how family works." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at him, stunned as though she was meeting a different man than the one she'd married. Gordon glared at me one last time. "You've really done a number on him, haven't you?" I stood slowly, my voice calm. "No, Gordon. I just reminded him of who he was before you started talking. That was the end of it." He turned abruptly and walked out of the room, muttering something, under his breath. Olivia hesitated, torn between following him and staying with Daniel. When she finally did go after her father, the sound of the front door closing behind them echoed like a long-awaited exhale. Daniel sat down again, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe I let things get that far," he murmured. "I didn't even recognize myself these past few weeks." I smiled softly. "It happens to the best of us. The world tells you that power means taking control, but real power comes from letting go of pride, of fear, of the need to prove yourself." He nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "I think I finally understand that." I reached over and placed my hand over his. "Your father would be proud of you." He looked up at me, eyes glistening. "I hope so." I smiled. "I know so." For the first time that Christmas, I felt peace. Not just in the room, but deep inside me. The chair creaked softly as I leaned back, the same way it used to when Henry sat there. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the moment sink in. I knew then that the tide had finally turned in my favor. Olivia didn't take kindly to losing control of the room. The moment Gordon stormed out, she stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes darting between Daniel and me. The silence stretched long enough to make the air feel heavy. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, the realization that her grip on the narrative had slipped, that Daniel wasn't the man she could easily steer anymore. "Daniel," she finally said, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. "How could you embarrass my father like that? In front of everyone?" Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Liv," he embarrassed himself, "he's been treating my mom like she doesn't belong in her own home. I can't keep pretending that's okay." Her lips parted in shock. "Pretending? So now I'm part of the problem?" He looked at her, steadily. "You invited your parents here, and instead of making them respect my mom, You stood by while they disrespected her. Olivia's arms crossed tightly. I was trying to keep the peace. No, Daniel said calmly. You were trying to keep control. There's a difference. The words landed hard. I stayed quiet, letting him speak for himself. This was his fight, now one he needed to have. Olivia's tone sharpened. You're choosing your mother over me. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. No, Olivia. I'm choosing what's right over what's easy. That stopped her cold. For a second, I thought she might actually cry, but then her composure hardened again, her chin lifting like a queen defending her pride. You have no idea what my father's done for us, Daniel. You think you'd even have your job right now without his help? He's been supporting you. Daniel shook his head. No. He's been controlling me. And I let him because I thought that's what gratitude looked like. But all he really wanted was power. She scoffed, her eyes flashing. Power? He's just a man who's earned respect. By stepping on people? Daniel shot back. Because that's all I've seen him do since he walked through that door. The argument escalated, voices clashing like storm waves. I sat still, calm on the outside, though my heart ached for them both. This wasn't just about Gordon anymore, this was about what had been festering beneath the surface of their marriage for years. Olivia turned toward me suddenly, her voice sharp. Are you happy now, Lillian? You've managed to turn my husband against me. I met her glare evenly. I didn't turn him against you, Olivia. I reminded him of who he is. Maybe you should try remembering who you are too. Her nostrils flared, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But she just stood there, trembling, her anger masking something deeper, fear, the kind of fear that comes when someone's world starts cracking in places they didn't even know were weak. Daniel stepped between us gently. Liv, no one's against you. We just can't live our lives trying to please your father anymore. She turned on him again. So what, you want to cut him off? Pretend he doesn't exist? He hesitated, then spoke softly. If it means protecting my family, then yes. Her face hardened, her voice dropping to a whisper. I can't believe you're saying this. I can, he replied. Because I've finally stopped being afraid of him or of disappointing you. That hit her harder than any raised voice could. Maybe I need to stay with my parents for a while, she said finally, her tone brittle. Daniel nodded quietly. If that's what you need. She looked between us one last time. Her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and pride. You'll regret this, she whispered. And then she turned and walked out. Her footsteps echoed through the hall, and a few seconds later, the sound of the front door closing followed, softer this time than her father's, but somehow heavier. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Daniel exhaled shakily and sank into the couch, his hands clasped together. Well, he muttered, I guess that's that. I reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. It's not the end of anything, Daniel. Sometimes people need to face themselves before they can come back whole. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I don't know what happens next. You rebuild, I said simply. Not for her, not for anyone else, but for yourself, and for your daughter. He looked up at me then, and I could see the tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. You really think we can fix this? I smiled softly. Families can survive a lot worse than pride, son. But only if both sides are willing to listen. He nodded, wiping his face. You know, I used to think strength meant keeping quiet and keeping everyone happy. But now I see that silence just lets the wrong people lead. I squeezed his hand. That's a lesson most people never learn. We sat there for a long time, the fire slowly dimming into glowing embers. Emma came down the stairs quietly, wrapped in her robe, her expression worried. Is everything okay? She asked softly. Daniel looked at her and smiled faintly. Yeah, he said. For the first time in a while, it might be. She came over and hugged him, and he held her tightly, the kind of hug that says more than words ever could. As they sat together, I looked at the chair, my chair gleaming softly in the light of the dying fire. It wasn't just a symbol of the past anymore. It was proof that respect, once taken, could be reclaimed. The night had been long and full of pain, but it had also been cleansing. The truth had been spoken, and the house felt lighter for it. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me, and just like that, the power he'd stolen was returned to where it belonged. The rest of Christmas was quieter, almost eerily peaceful. After the shouting, the slammed doors, and the storm of emotion, the silence that followed felt strange, almost fragile. The house seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for days. I spent the next morning in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the holiday chaos. Empty plates, half-drunk cups of cider, torn wrapping paper that had somehow found its way under every piece of furniture. Daniel joined me after a while. His face looked tired but softer, calmer. He wasn't carrying that same tension in his shoulders anymore. Without Gordon's shadow looming over him, he seemed lighter, like a boy who'd finally set down a heavy backpack he didn't realize he'd been carrying. He took the dish rag from me. "Mom, sit down," he said gently. "I've got this." I smiled faintly. "You've been saying that since you were 12. Back then, you'd just stack everything in one big pile and say you cleaned." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, I've learned a few things since then." I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around a mug of coffee. For the first time in a long while, it actually tasted warm, not just in temperature, but in comfort. "I'm sorry," Daniel said suddenly, his voice breaking through the quiet. "For what?" I asked. "For not standing up sooner, for letting them walk all over you, over us." He paused, looking down at the dishwater. "I didn't mean to choose sides, I just wanted peace." I nodded slowly. "Peace is good, Daniel, but it's not peace if you have to silence yourself to keep it." He looked up, and for a moment, he looked just like his father, the same steady eyes, the same quiet strength. "You're right, I see that now." After a while, Emma came downstairs, still in her pajamas. She kissed my cheek and smiled. "Feels different today," she said softly. "It does," I replied. "Like the house can finally breathe again." She nodded, glancing toward the living room. "You going to keep the plaque there?" I followed her gaze to the chair, Henry's chair gleaming in the morning light. The little wooden plaque rested proudly on the cushion, the words, "Seat of Power," shining faintly. "Yes," I said. "It's earned its place." Emma grinned. "Good, it looks right." Around noon, Daniel's phone buzzed. He hesitated before answering. It was Olivia. I could see the nervousness flicker across his face as he stepped outside to take the call. When he came back in a few minutes later, his expression was unreadable. "She's staying with her parents for now," he said finally. "She said she needs time." I nodded. "Fair." He sighed. "I told her I loved her. I still do. But I also told her things have to change. No more letting her dad dictate what respect looks like." "That's a good start," I said softly. "Love isn't about control, Daniel. It's about growth. Sometimes that means stepping back." He nodded, staring into the fire. "I want her to see that we can have both success and compassion. Maybe then she'll understand." Emma placed a gentle hand on his arm. "She will, or she won't. Either way, you're finally standing on your own." He gave her a faint smile. "Guess I've got Dad to thank for that. And Mom." I smiled too, but my heart ached a little. Not from sadness, but from the bittersweet truth that growth often comes through pain. Later that afternoon, the three of us sat in the living room together, me, Daniel, and Emma, eating leftover pie and talking about nothing in particular. For the first time all weekend, the laughter felt real again. No performance, no tension. Just family. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft and steady, blanketing the ground in white. The fire crackled gently, and the faint scent of cinnamon filled the air. At one point, Daniel leaned back and looked at the chair. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I think Dad would have loved seeing this. You sitting there, the house full again." I nodded, my throat tightening. He'd have said, "Took you long enough to remember what matters." That made both of them laugh. As the day faded into evening, Daniel helped me tidy up once more, and Emma started packing her things to head home. She hugged me tightly before leaving. "You're amazing, Mom," she whispered. Most people would have lost it, but you handled all this with grace. Grace and a little bit of stubbornness, I said with a smile. She laughed. Dad would have been proud. When the house was finally quiet again, I sat alone in the chair, watching. The fire die down. The plaque rested on my lap, the wood warm against my palms. I traced the carved letters slowly, feeling the grooves beneath my fingers. Seat of power. I whispered to myself. Henry, you'd get a kick out of this. I could almost hear his chuckle in response, that deep, kind laugh that always made me feel safe. Daniel came back into the room one last time before bed. Mom, he said softly. Thank you for not giving up on me. I never could, I said. You're my son. He smiled, leaned down, and kissed my forehead. I'm going to make things right for all of us. I know you will, I replied. He went upstairs, and I stayed by the fire a while longer, letting the quiet fill every corner of the house. There was peace again, not because everyone agreed, but because truth had been spoken. I leaned back, feeling the chair creak beneath me. For the first time in years, that sound didn't make me sad. It made me proud. But I still had one final gesture to make, one that would seal the lesson forever. A week later, I invited everyone over again this time, for a quieter dinner. The snow had settled thick outside, blanketing the neighborhood in soft white silence. Christmas decorations still twinkled faintly along the eaves of houses, though most families had already taken their trees down. I hadn't. I left mine up not because I was clinging to the holiday, but because I wanted that feeling of warmth to linger just a little longer. I decided to host another dinner. Not a grand affair. Just something simple: stew, bread, and warmth. I invited Daniel, of course, and Emma. And, after some thought, I extended the invitation to Olivia too. I didn't expect her to accept. But she did. When she arrived, she looked different, less polished. More subdued. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and the spark of superiority that once danced in her eyes was gone. She stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clasped together. Thank you for inviting me, she said quietly. Your family, I replied, giving her a small smile. You'll always have a place here. Daniel came in right behind her, carrying a bouquet of winter lilies. He smiled as he handed them to me. For the house, he said. For Dad. I took them, my heart swelling. He would have liked these. After dinner, as the plates were cleared and the fire began to crackle, I asked everyone to gather in the living room. Henry's chair stood proudly by the hearth, the seat of power plaque resting on the small pedestal beside it. The light from the fire caught the engraving, making it gleam like gold. I looked around at my family, smaller now, maybe, but stronger for everything we'd been through. Before we finish tonight, I began, there's something I'd like to share. Olivia shifted slightly, her expression uncertain. Daniel nodded encouragingly, and Emma leaned forward, her eyes soft with curiosity. I took a deep breath. You all know how much this chair means to me, I said. But what you might not know is that when Henry built it, he carved something into the bottom of the seat. Words I didn't understand back then but do now. Emma tilted her head. What did it say? Power doesn't sit above people, I quoted softly. It sits with them. The room went still. The fire popped gently, as though punctuating the silence that followed. When he built this chair, I continued, he wasn't thinking about control or ownership. He was thinking about connection. Every time one of us sat here to talk, to laugh, to cry, it reminded us that family isn't about hierarchy, it's about heart. Daniel's eyes glistened. I never knew he wrote that. I didn't either, I said. Not until a few years after he passed. I used to sit here and run my fingers along the wood, wondering why he hid it underneath. Now I understand. He didn't want to tell us what power meant. He wanted us to discover it ourselves. Olivia looked at the plaque then. Her voice small. I think I understand now too, she said. I spent so much time watching my dad chase power that I thought that's what success looked like. But seeing all of this, she gestured to the room, to Daniel, to the chair. This feels real. I never saw it before. I smiled at her genuinely this time. It's never too late to start seeing. Daniel took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. But I think we're getting there. Olivia nodded, her eyes watering slightly. I'm sorry for everything, Lillian. I was proud and blind. Pride's a tricky thing, I said softly. It makes us think we're standing tall when we're really just standing alone. Emma smiled faintly. That sounds like something Dad would have said. I chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe I just learned from the best. We all laughed quietly. The heaviness that had hung over us since Christmas lifted, replaced by something warm and fragile forgiveness. I stood and walked to the chair, resting my hand on its back. This will stay here as long as this house stands, I said. Not as a throne, but as a reminder that leadership starts with love. That respect isn't given to the loudest voice, but to the truest heart. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice low. We needed this. Yes, I said. We all did. For a few moments, no one spoke. The fire flickered softly, and the snow outside glowed faintly under the streetlights. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm. Then, my granddaughter, Lily, who had been sitting quietly on the rug, looked up at me with her big brown eyes. Grandma, she said innocently, can I sit in the seat of power someday? Everyone chuckled softly, but I crouched down beside her and smiled. Of course. You can, sweetheart. But remember, it's not about power, it's about kindness. Whoever sits here has to promise to use their heart first. She nodded solemnly. I promise. I kissed her forehead and stood again, my heart full. The room felt lighter, brighter, as if Henry himself were sitting quietly beside us, smiling that proud, knowing smile of his. Daniel put an arm around Olivia, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something real between them, not pride or performance, but understanding. As we said our goodbyes that night, Daniel lingered for a moment before leaving. Mom, he said softly. Thank you for teaching me what strength really looks like. I smiled. You always had it in you, Daniel. You just needed to see it reflected back. When the door finally closed and the house grew still again, I stood in front of the chair, letting my fingers brush over the plaque one last time. It wasn't just furniture anymore. It was legacy, not just Henry's, but mine too. A story carved in wood and memory, passed from one generation to the next. And I knew that my family had finally remembered who we truly were. I learned that power doesn't come from taking control, it comes from never letting go of what matters most. The snow outside had begun to melt, turning the streets into rivers of silver under the winter sun. Christmas had long since passed, but inside my house, the warmth remained. The lights were dimmer now, the tree slowly shedding its needles. Yet the energy within those walls felt renewed, stronger, steadier, peaceful. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable holiday. Daniel stopped by, often not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. Sometimes he came with Olivia, sometimes alone, and each visit carried less tension than the last. The conversations had shifted too. They weren't about control or expectations anymore. They were about family, work, laughter, and healing. One Saturday morning, I was sitting in Henry's chair, reading a book, when Daniel knocked softly and stepped in with a shy grin. Morning, Mom, he said. Morning, sweetheart, I replied. Coffee's on the counter. He poured himself a cup and joined me by the fire. For a while, we didn't speak, we didn't have to. The silence was comfortable now, full of understanding. He glanced at the plaque beside the chair and smiled faintly. You know, he said, I've been thinking about what Dad wrote, that power sits with people, not above them. It's been running through my head a lot lately. I nodded. He believed that to his core, and he lived it every day. Daniel took a sip of coffee. I've been trying to do the same. At work, with Olivia. With Lily. Just leading differently. Less about being right. More about being fair. I smiled softly. Sounds like your father, he chuckled. I guess I finally inherited something from him other than his nose. That made me laugh. It was a simple, genuine sound, one I hadn't heard from either of us in too long. A few hours later, Olivia arrived with Lily. To my surprise, She carried a small box wrapped in silver paper. "A peace offering," she said quietly. I smiled and took it. Inside was a small brass frame. The photo inside was from that last dinner, all of us sitting together. The chair gleaming behind us. On the bottom edge, she had engraved 3 words. "Heart before power." My eyes stung. "It's beautiful," I whispered. Olivia smiled weakly. "I think I finally understand now what that means." "You do," I said gently. "And that's what matters." We spent the afternoon together, playing with Lily, eating leftovers, talking about plans for the new year. There were no lectures, no arguments, no pretense, just family, real, imperfect, but whole. Later, when Daniel and Olivia left, I sat alone again by the fire. The light flickered across the walls, and for the first time, I didn't feel lonely. The quiet wasn't emptiness anymore, it was peace. I looked over at the chair, and my gaze settled on the plaque. Seat of Power. It didn't feel like a title anymore. It felt like a reminder. That chair had witnessed every stage of my life: love, laughter, loss, and redemption. It had seen my children grow, my husband pass, my heart break and heal. And now, it stood as a symbol that strength wasn't about commanding others, it was about standing firm when the world tried to move you. The following Sunday, Emma stopped by with her daughter. She found me polishing the armrests, humming softly. "You're at it again," she teased. I smiled. "Just keeping it alive." She knelt beside me, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "You ever think about what's going to happen to it when you're gone?" Emma smiled knowingly. "Lily's already claimed it, you know. She told me she wants to sit here when she's grown up." I laughed. "Then I'd better keep it in good condition." Emma grinned. "Something tells me you will." That night, as the sun dipped below the snow-covered rooftops, I sat once more in the chair, staring into the glowing embers of the fire. Lily's words from that dinner echoed in my head. "Can I sit in the seat of power someday?" It had made me think maybe that's what all this had been about. Passing down something more than furniture or tradition. Passing down meaning. I thought about Gordon then. I hadn't seen or heard from him since that day. Daniel said he'd reached out once, just to clear the air. But the conversation had been brief. Apparently, Gordon had mellowed a bit, maybe embarrassed, maybe reflective. Either way, I didn't need to hear from him. His absence was peace enough. Olivia had changed too. Slowly, gently, she'd started listening more, speaking less. Even when she disagreed, there was a softness in her tone now, a humility that hadn't been there before. Growth looks different on everyone, but in her, it looked like grace finally taking root. And Daniel, my son, was stronger than ever. Not in the way Gordon had tried to make him, but in his own quiet, steady way. I'd see it when he held his daughter, when he comforted his wife, when he smiled without needing anyone's approval. He'd become the man his father had always hoped he'd be. I leaned back, closing my eyes. The chair creaked softly beneath me, and in that sound, I heard everything: Henry's laughter, Daniel's childhood giggles, Emma's teenage chatter, Lily's innocent questions. Generations of love layered into the grain of wood. A memory surfaced then, the first Christmas after Henry built the chair. He'd looked at me as we sat by the fire, the kids asleep upstairs, and said, "One day, this will outlast us. It'll hold our story long after we're gone." He was right, it had. I opened my eyes and looked at the fire once more. Its glow danced over the plaque, making the words shimmer. I reached out, touched the edge of it, and whispered softly, "You were right again, Henry. You always are." A soft knock at the door startled me. It was Lily, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Grandma," she said sleepily. "Can I sit with you for a bit?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, opening my arms. She climbed onto my lap, curling against me. Together, we watched the fire burn low, the warmth wrapping around us like a blanket. After a while, she looked up at me and asked, "Grandma, why do you call it the seat of power?" I smiled and kissed her forehead. Because real power doesn't sit above people, my love. It sits with them. She nodded slowly, her little eyelids drooping. Like love? Exactly, I whispered. Just like love. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The world felt still at peace. And that Christmas, I reclaimed not just my chair, but my place as the heart of my family.